firsthand from a woman who is both a witness to and as a Holocaust survivor, a victim of history. I hope you'll listen, understand, and appreciate the message of hope, courage, and compassion that she will share with us today. It's my honor and privilege to introduce you to our special guest, Marion Blumenthal Lazan. Hello, Marion.
Hello. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Mr. Bernstein, for once again giving me the opportunity to participate in this year's Thaler Holocaust Education Commemoration and reaching the Cedar Rapids, Iowa community and way, way beyond. And Mr. Robert Becker, again, I thank you for sharing your tech expertise with us. Thank you. I so very much wished that I could be with all of you in person. But since we still have this COVID in our midst, we will use this amazing Zoom technology to connect with one another. I'm here with you to share my story. It is my childhood experiences during World War II in the concentration camps. I will tell you about our liberation and how we finally started our lives anew in our blessed United States of America. Mine is a story that Anne Frank might have told had she survived. This is also a story that conveys a message of perseverance, determination, faith, and above all, hope. After the presentation, I will be pleased to answer some of your questions. Life in the early 1930s in Germany was very much for my family as it is here for most of us today. Never did we think that the anti-Semitic incidents there would ever lead to very much. My father was in a successful shoe business in a small town. My parents, 2-year older brother, and I lived comfortably with my grandparents above the shoe store. Life for Jews was made increasingly more difficult. And in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were formulated and enforced. The following are just some of the many restrictions imposed on the Jews in Germany. Jews were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was an evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on and on. And it was then that my parents decided to make arrangements to leave the country. My grandparents, who were in the late 70s and ill, refused to leave their home. They could not understand the urgency or the necessity of doing so. My grandparents passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other. And soon thereafter, we received our necessary papers for our emigration to America. I was just 4 years old at that time. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night. It was the night of broken glass when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, and Jewish books were burned and destroyed. This was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews in Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. In reality, this was the beginning of the Holocaust. On November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. These imposed taxes were used to rearm Germany. The night of Kristallnacht, our apartment was ransacked. All valuables were thrown into a pillowcase and taken away. But worst of all was that they transported my father to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. All sorts of terrible stories were related to my mother, and we did not know if we would ever see my father again. He was released after 3 weeks only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. And to think that just a few years prior, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for his military service in the German army of World War I. We were forced to sell both our home and our business for a fraction of its worth. And soon thereafter, in January of 1939, we left for Holland, from where we were to sail to the United States. And for almost 9 months, while awaiting our quota number from the American State Department, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children. These young children had been sent by their parents from various parts of Europe to escape from the Nazis. In December of that year, 1939, we were deported to the detention camp of Westerbork in Holland to await our departure date to America. Camp Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. In May of 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure date, the Germans invaded Holland and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were about to be loaded aboard ship, were burned and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam was bombed. Under Dutch control, Camp Westerbork was tolerable. My mother, father, brother, and I shared two small rooms. We all ate in a communal dining room, and at that time there was enough food for us so that we did not go hungry. Adults were assigned to various work duties. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and lived a very dull, stagnant life. Several months later, when the Nazi SS took over the command of Westerbork, we became acquainted with the ever present, terrifying 12-foot high barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family, Camp Westerbork became overcrowded. And it was at that time that we had to share our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. This started in early 1942. And from then on, every Monday night, lists of those to be deported were posted, causing incredible anxiety, anguish, and fear. And then on Tuesday mornings, men, women, and little ones were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. This area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. At 11 o'clock on Tuesday mornings, the trains left for their destination. And of the total 120,000 men, women, and children that departed Westerbork, 102,000 were doomed never to return. In January of 1944, it was our turn to be shipped out. We children were actually glad for a change of environment. We were very naive and we welcomed the move. We were allowed to take one knapsack each, and whatever we could stuff into it, we were permitted to take. When we approached the railroad platform and we saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel, our fears began to mount. Adults suspected, and they somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us and threatening us with their weapons and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old. And to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evenings, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other. And this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. We were forced, we were placed in this particular section of the camp with the hope of being exchanged for German nationals in Palestine, which the British put under house arrest because they were citizens of an enemy country. This hope, unfortunately, never materialized for our family. 600 of us, 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks, meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with two people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only one thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress. And this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for two people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine two adults, two strangers sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions? A bunk that was no larger than the small cut bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy, there was no toilet paper, there was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, we had to slosh through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning, without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peels. The bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we had saved up from the previous week. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. We had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and we therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. The dark, crowded quarters often caused us to trip and fall over the dead. Bodies could not be taken away fast enough. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you've all heard, you've read, students have studied, adults have seen movies, perhaps even two documentaries about the Shoah, about the Holocaust. But the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror, and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there was a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make believe games. And one game, a game based on superstition, became very important to me. I decided that if I were to find four pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the four members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find the third or fourth pebble? Might that mean that one or two of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women, and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked, and somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards entered our barrack for surprise inspection. And in our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure had I cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Camp Bergen-Belsen were dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to Eastern Europe, towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. We did not know that Auschwitz, with its gas chambers, had already been liberated. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they're going to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities. That meant no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive. And who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me explain typhus. It is a highly contagious, deadly disease that's caused from filth and spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off and buried along the tracks. In addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's one out of every five, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burned leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed through the train seeking civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over their homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos, or as we know it here, 35 pounds, and my mother weighed a mere 70 pounds. The Russians, in a crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition, and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medication and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also relearned to walk. And in the interim, our heads were shaved because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. The weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. Flowers were in bloom. Birds were singing. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation. And this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother, Albert, actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I am relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. It is a wonderful story as to how we gradually recuperated and was sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. My brother and I were eventually placed in the children's home, in a youth Aliyah home, in preparation to live in what was then British mandated Palestine, and we know today as Israel. Most of the children in this home survived alone, without their parents. I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to resettle into a normal society. Had no training for that. Here I was by this time, 11 years old. I had never been in a store, had no idea what money was all about, had almost no table manners. It was like learning to live all over again. It was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. Meals served us were delicious and nourishing, and you can imagine that just about anything and everything tasted good to us. And though our surrogate parents provided a very strict environment, much love and care were given us. I began my first formal education at that time at the age of 11 and a half. We were taught the secular subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, in a Montessori school where we progressed at our own pace. The Dutch language in which we were taught was all new to us. We also received a thorough education in Hebrew and in religious studies. The British, who were governing Palestine in the 1940s, had issued what was known as the White Paper, restricting the number of Jews permitted into the land. They were intercepting many of the refugee ships and interning the survivors on the island of Cyprus, and in some cases, turning the ships back to Europe. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Arabs and Jews, which in May of 1948 led to the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1947, just 1 year prior to Israel becoming a state, our illegal voyage from Holland to Palestine was planned, and danger once again loomed over us. And because parents at that time were not permitted to accompany their children, my mother managed to make arrangements for a family of three to emigrate to the United States. And thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier. We arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948. By coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. It was a Jewish relief organization, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, the Hayas, that found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. I had never heard of Illinois, definitely not Peoria. And there, at the age of 13, I once again started life anew in a strange land and again learning a new language, my third new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the fourth grade with 9-year-olds. Although both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, I nevertheless found time, actually made time, to take extra courses during the year, attend summer school, and by working very hard in my studies, I was able to be graduated from Peoria Central High School 5 years later at age 18, ranking 8th in a class of 267 students. It was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Nathaniel Lazan, who I met at the age of 16 in Peoria on the holiday of Yom Kippur in the synagogue. And we are so grateful, so very grateful to have celebrated our 67th wedding anniversary this past August. Nathaniel, come and say hello to all these nice people from around the world.
Hello, everybody.
This is Nathaniel, tremendously, tremendously supportive in all respects. And he's my computer guy, in addition to you, Robert. And he was an Air Force pilot and tremendously disciplined in all areas. I am grateful. I am very grateful to have survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with my husband, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. We have three grown children, all three are happily married, and they've given us 9 beautiful grandchildren and 7 magnificent great grandchildren. Amazing, amazing. And Dalia, our granddaughter in Israel, is participating in this afternoon's presentation. Dalia, I'm so, so glad to have you on board. And in March of 1996, my memoir, Four Perfect Pebbles, co-authored by Lila Pearl, was published by Green Willow, division of HarperCollins. It is now in its 34th printing in hardback. And Harper decided to do a 20th anniversary edition. This is their copy of the 20th, and where am I? I really don't like this cover at all because it must be because of that barbed wire and that brings back bad memories, but they were in charge, and so be it. Has been translated into German, into Dutch. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem published it in Hebrew, and they did a super, super job on it. And if you like, you may all read it in Japanese. But above all, I am so grateful that the story is in book form so that it can be passed on to future generations. And I'm thrilled that a documentary has been made entitled Marion's Triumph with the actress Deborah Messing as the narrator. So you see that despite all the terrible things that happened to me as a child, my life today is full and rewarding. Although I've spoken to upward of 1.5 million students and adults over these past 20 some years, it still has not become easy. However, I do realize the importance of sharing that period of our history with you, simply because in a few short years, we will not be here any longer to give a first-hand account. You, the students who are here this afternoon, it is your generation that is the very last generation that will hear these stories firsthand. And I therefore ask you to please share my story or any of the Holocaust stories that you read and hear about. Share them with your friends, share them with your relatives, and someday share them with your children. And yes, even with your grandchildren. When we're not here any longer, it is you who will have to bear witness. As difficult as it is, the horror of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, must be taught, must be studied, and kept alive. Only then can we guard it from ever happening again. This, I don't know if you can see this because I don't see my image at all on the screen at this point. Can you? Okay. All right, here we go. This is the very yellow star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us, to isolate us, and to set us apart from the rest of society. This represents the Star of David, our Magen David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol. But the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such destruction from reoccurring. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the national origin. This respect towards one another must begin in our homes, around the kitchen table, the dining room table, wherever we gather as a family. We, the adults, must pass it on our places of business. You, the students, must pass it on in the halls of your school, in the communities, in the towns, in the cities. And only if there is respect and tolerance and compassion towards one another in the countries can we expect to have peace in the world. We must begin with our children. Let us treat people as individuals. Let us look for similarities and respect the difference. Let us build bridges and reach out towards one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow the leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. It is not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. Please, please remember these messages. Share them with your friends who are unable to be with us this afternoon. share them, remember them, but above all, let us all live by them. We're all aware, or we should be, that 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust of the Second World War. The state of Iowa, who are the host for this afternoon's presentation, has a population of approximately 3 million. Can you possibly imagine twice the population of Iowa wiped out? The 6 million also represent 1/3 of the entire pre-World War II Jewish population. Among them were 1.5 million children. We also need to remember that we also have to remember that 5 million non-Jews lost their lives. And among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them. Very, very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. They would hide them in the attics. They would hide them in the basements. Farmers would hide them out in the barns. They were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they also were deported to concentration camps and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages, messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history and certainly apply to today's world situation and definitely to our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future. I now would like to share with you something about a very, very special lady, my mom. This was my mother on her 104th birthday. Mom passed away 6 weeks short of her 105th birthday. Amazing, amazing, wise, beautiful lady. She was a wonderful, wonderful mother-in-law to Nathaniel. Nathaniel was the best son-in-law imaginable to my mom. There were two things that my mother demanded of my brother and me when we came to America. Number one, learn English, learn it quickly. Number two, work as hard as you can in school and at work in order to succeed. You need to know that my mother was 40 years old when she came to America. 40, knew no English whatsoever, learned to read, write, and speak a magnificent English. A remarkable, remarkable lady. My brother, Albert, passed away 3.5 years ago. He dealt with this altogether differently than I did not talk about it as freely as you heard it from me this afternoon. Lived in California, happily married, but by choice did not bring children into this world. Had a very difficult time with organized religion. All of that made me very sad, but I did not fault Albert. We have to remember, he was 2 years older than I am, was with my father in the men's section, and I am convinced that he saw and experienced things that I did not. God puts us on this earth, gives us a beautiful mind. It is this mind that allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. Therefore, men did this to one another. But did he have to make it so bitterly cold when we were standing out there on the Pell all day? I have a direct line. I ask loads of questions. Don't get too many answers, but that's okay. Faith I will always have. After all, here I am. 3 children, 9 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren from whom generations will be forthcoming. He made sure that enough of us survived so that we will always be here. I am proud of my faith, as I'm certain you are proud of your faith and of your heritage. But please, please, let us all remember to respect the right of others to their belief. Be kind and good and respectful and tolerant and compassionate towards one another. That is the basis for peace. Had there been respect and tolerance towards one another some 70, 80 years ago, I would not be with you this afternoon to share that dark period of our history. 9/11 would not have occurred. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, all these countries that are in such turmoil would be peaceful countries for its people. Be kind and good towards one another, please. It is such an easy message and yet so difficult to achieve. There is very little that we can do against the negativity in our world, but how we treat, behave, and reach out towards one another, that is entirely up to us. Did I ever find my four pebbles? Is a frequently asked question. I always found my four pebbles. I made it my business to find them. I cheated all the time. When I found them, I put them in a safe place. Next time I would search for them and I couldn't find that third one or that fourth one, well, I knew exactly where to go and pick them up. Maybe that was cheating, but it was my game, and guess who made the rules? You need to know that I was only about 9 or 10 years old when things were at its absolute worst. We had nothing, nothing to occupy our time with constructively. No paper, no pencils, no books, certainly no games. So I was lucky at such an imaginative mind, and my imaginative games were always based on a positive attitude. I would search for a piece of glass, a piece of a mirror, whatever I could find on the dirt ground in Bergen-Belsen. And when the sun would shine, which didn't happen nearly often enough in that part of Germany, known for bad weather and cloudy skies, but I, Marion, knew that that sun would always come out. And when it did, that little piece of glass would would cast a reflection onto the ground. And that little wiggly reflection, it became my pet. As long as the sun would shine, I would have my pet, and my pet would never ever die. I would also imagine that one day I once again would have my three B's. And these three B's represent our everyday comforts and necessities that we all take so much for granted. First, we represented a bed. I knew that someday I once again would have my very own bed with a real mattress, clean sheets, and enough blankets to keep me warm. Second B represented a bath, warm water, soap, clean towel, and with that would come toothpaste and a toothbrush, of course. And the third B was bread. I knew that someday I once again would have enough bread so that I would never again go hungry. These imaginary games, if you will, they were my survival techniques. They were my survival skills. Do you know that we all have survival techniques and skills within us? When the need arises, we just have to search for them, find them, and be sure that we put them to work. No one is spared adversity. No one is spared hardship. We all have to overcome obstacles at one time or another. But with perseverance, with determination, with faith, and above all, hope, one can overcome just about anything and everything. Above all, never, ever give up hope. It is not so much what happens to a person, it's how we deal with the situation that makes the difference. Nathaniel's from New York. He went to Bradley University in Peoria. Lucky me. He went home on vacations, and way back then in the 1950s, long distance telephone calls were very expensive. There were no computers, there were no emails, there was no texting, but for a 3-cent stamp, and there really was such a thing as a 3-cent stamp, we would write to one another every single day. Major, major problems. in his letters to me, he would add 5 words that he asked me to define and put into a sentence. That's a lot of nerve with all I had to do, but I knew that he wanted to help me with my English, and I guess it did work. So, Nathaniel, I thank you.
You're quite welcome, Marion.
I, on the other hand, would write my letters in rough draft with a dictionary by my side, and only when I was satisfied with the way the letter was written would I dare mail it to him. Talking about a dictionary, my father always carried a little chunky German English dictionary with him, and he would study the vocabulary in secret whenever possible, always with the hope that someday he would reach America. When we came to the United States back in 1948 and approached New York Harbor, we were told the night before that if we wanted to see the Statue of Liberty, we needed to be on deck bright and early the next morning. Well, you can be sure that each and every one of us was on deck to greet and be greeted by that magnificent symbol of freedom, the freedom that had been denied us for so many years. And when that tall figure of that longed for symbol appeared, I became too choked up to talk. So many emotions seized me at once: joy and gratitude, bitterness and bitterness for the cruelty that we and so many others had suffered, and deep, deep sadness that Papa, my father, could not share this moment with us. He would never know that we had reached America at last. And to this day, when we crossed the Verrazano Bridge, let me briefly explain the Verrazano Bridge. It's a long bridge in New York that connects the borough of Staten Island with that of Brooklyn. And when we reach a certain point on that bridge, I will always crane my neck to see the Statue of Liberty. It's a most magnificent, beautiful, meaningful sight. We returned to Germany on various occasions, at least about 8 times. The very first time we returned was in 1995. It was the 50th anniversary of our liberation. And we visited my father's grave. And the reason my father and about 60 others have a private resting place in that farm village where we were liberated was because they died after some of the chaos had subsided. Those who died early on were all buried in mass graves. We also went to Bergen-Belsen, and Bergen-Belsen looks nothing the way I remembered it. Had been burned down under the direction of President Eisenhower, who was then the commander of the Allied forces, because the conditions of the camp would have created tremendous health hazards for the entire region of Germany. So today, other than the newly built documentation exhibition centers, Bergen-Belsen looks like a park: green grass, shrubs, trees, not bad looking at all, except for the mounds everywhere, mounds with flags that read, "Here lie 1,000, here lie 2,500. These are the mass graves of our people. We also went to my former hometown of Hoya near Hanover, and they were greeted by public officials who apologized over and over again. And then there was a young non-Jewish couple born after the war who took us to the Jewish cemetery, which was in terrible disarray, had not been cared for since 1938. Took us to our family plot, and there, among the toppled over stones, was a brand new shiny granite footstone with the inscription: Zur Erinnerung an die zerstörte Grabstelle der Familie Blumenthal, Hoja 1894 bis 1938, in memory of the desecrated plot of the Blumenthal family, Hoya 1894 to 1938, placed there by this non-Jewish young couple, unbeknownst to us. A most beautiful, generous, kind gesture. Never thought that I would refer to non-Jewish Germans in such glowing terms. It's people like these that renew one's faith in humanity and that become dear, dear friends of ours. And each time we return, I speak in schools and I speak in universities and at times in churches, and it's tremendously well received, but also difficult for today's young generation to hear about that dark period of their history as well. After all, it's their grandparents and great grandparents' generation that were responsible for such terror. We also returned in 2010. Why? Because a brand new public high school in my former hometown was named in my honor. So now we have the Marion Blumenthal Oberschule in Hoya, a tremendous celebration and very courageous for this little town to redress what happened so many years ago in their midst. And the night before the celebration, we commemorated the night of broken glass on the site where our synagogue once stood. All very difficult trips, but no regret having returned. At this point, I also would like to share with you that Germany is doing everything possible to continually remind their people as to what happened during the Second World War. First of all, it is mandatory for the subject to be taught in their schools. And what they do have done as of late is make put stumbling blocks. They're called Stolpersteine in front of the houses. Oh, very good, Robert. How did you do that? Wow. Okay. You can see the image of these metal plaques, which are deeply embedded in the sidewalk in front of the homes of the person who once lived there and never returned. On that plaque is his or her name, date of birth, where, when, and how he or she died. An amazing tribute for those who did not make it. And this was fairly recent, but just in the last 8, 10 years or so. And that has to be commended for sure. Um, do I still speak those languages?
You
But
returned from the school. Oh, you said that.
that's it. I said that. Okay. Nathaniel reminded me of something, but I did that. Okay. Uh, do I still speak those languages? Ik spreek een klein beetje Hollands. I speak a little bit of Dutch. Annehme der Berge Vriekenzat. I speak some Hebrew. Ich spreche ein sehr gutes Deutsch. I speak an excellent German. And I do speak some English. I need you to know that there's always something that reminds me of my years at the camps. Never a day goes by, and I mean that. Never a day goes by when I'm not somehow reminded of what happened in my life so many years ago. For instance, a number of years ago, I needed surgery on my face. Something needed to be cauterized. It needed to be burned away. And as soon as a surgeon began with that procedure, I told them to stop. And after I explained to him that the smell of the burning flesh reminded me of my years at the camps, and after I had a drink of water, I permitted him to continue. And then I do my shopping, and my bill might come to $19.43. Checkout clerk will hear me say 1943 was a terrible year. And if they need an explanation, they'll get it. Not as lengthy as you heard it, but they'll get it. But then again, if my bill comes to $19.53, they'll get to hear, oh, my 1953 was a wonderful year, the best year of my life. And that's the year Nathaniel and I were married. So these are things that remind me. And then I see people wasting food, and it just hurts me beyond. Please, please, please put as much food on your plate as you think you can eat. Don't pile it on, eat some of it and discard the rest. Don't do that. Next time you want to throw food, particularly bread out, remember the story you heard this afternoon. So that's always something that reminds me. I'm also asked, what was the worst thing for me to deal with while I was in the camps as a child? and as far as I am concerned, was to deal with the emotion of fear. I was always afraid of what would happen to us next, afraid of who would die next. Would my mother come back from her work duties? As far as I'm concerned, fear was the worst thing for me to deal with. Mr. Bernstein, are there any questions? I'll be pleased to answer them. Hello.
There are many questions, and I think Jim is going
I'm
to come
here.
on.
I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry. I had to unmute myself. Yeah, there are several questions. You mentioned, Marion, your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren, so we know that they exist. One of the questions had to do with whether any of them are active in delivering your message and the message of hope and love that you have. Are they active in doing that?
Are they active in doing? Wonderful question. Dahlia, our granddaughter, is on board this afternoon. Did you hear that? Okay. I would like to think that eventually they will take over when I'm no longer able. So this is my hope. And they certainly are very, very familiar with the story. And they, I firmly believe, yes, that they will take over once.
May I add that
Yes,
there have been
please.
plenty of
This is our Dahlia, for those
hi,
of
nice
you who haven't met it.
there have been plenty of times stories that I've told, like of my grandmother's story throughout my years, and I always I try to read the book and try to listen to your stories after,
So, all right.
so I can please so I can leave your heritage for many more years.
You maintain and you keep the story going for your generation and beyond, right? That's a promise, right?
Right?
Okay. Okay, right. Okay. This is our lovely granddaughter, Dahlia. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Don.
So the answer, you heard a first-hand answer to your question.
Yes,
and so did
indeed.
I. Right.
Yes, indeed. Marion, if you think it's appropriate to answer this question, does anything about what happened to you, let me rephrase that. Are any events that are happening today in the United States reminiscent to you of what happened in pre-World War II Europe? And I think the questioner is probably referring to the rise of white supremacism in the country. Is it anything?
What is the exact question, though?
The exact question is, are you concerned about anything that's happening in the U.S. today?
Of course I'm concerned, just like you are all concerned, very concerned. And we have to educate our people, the young ones, today's young generation, as well as the adults. There is not enough education pertaining to this subject. And when it comes to the Holocaust deniers or those white supremacists or whatever they are, some people don't know how to talk back to them, so that they have the upper hand, which is also dangerous. And I had mentioned this earlier, this morning's presentation. I fault the media for giving these Holocaust deniers and those white supremacists or whoever they are way too much publicity. If there's no publicity about them, there'll be no one to listen to them, and that'll be the end of them. So I fault the media for taking so much time and giving them so much, not credit, but publicity and attention. So it's anyway, we have to educate our people so that we can oppose all that negativities that we're surrounded by, unfortunately. Yeah.
Marion, other than your own book, are there other memoirs that you've read that you would recommend?
I don't read them. I try to, I stay away from reading any of the stories. As I'd mentioned earlier, I sort of have to separate myself, but I do definitely know other stories. There is one, I've lived 1,000 years, I think that's her name, from Livia Baton Jackson. She was also in Bergen-Belsen, and she now lives in Israel, which is also a very good book, but I happen to know her personally. And any one of them, no two stories are alike, and they all need to be heard and shared. And there's always, always something new to learn from these memoirs, for sure.
Have you experienced anti-Semitism since you've lived in the United States?
Never, ever. Not personally. Never.
No?
Nope. No. And if they tried, boy, did I get it back from me. Yeah. So, and as many times as I've spoken, oh my goodness, as I've mentioned,
2,000 times.
Nathaniel keeps track of all this. He just told me I've spoken 2,000 times. Well, it seems like over the past 20 years. Okay, so personally, I've never been confronted with anything negative. People might have, during the course of the presentation, had some negative thoughts, but by the time I get done, I guess they decided against voicing any. So, nope, I had no problem, and I'm grateful for that. So I'm also asked whether I have a tattoo on my arm. I do not. That was done in Auschwitz only. It was not, the number was not burned on any of the hundreds of major and sub camps that existed in Poland and in Germany and in other areas of Europe. It was done in Auschwitz only to dehumanize our people, to again inflict pain, and to think that Germany at that time was one of the most cultured nations in the world. And that these men and women went home at night to their own families as though they had a 9-to-5 job, a mentality none of us will ever understand. Okay.
Before you
go ahead.
Marion, before you deliver some final words, I want to remind everyone that we are recording this session and that we'll have the recording up on the Thaler Holocaust Memorial Fund's website here in the next couple of days. And that website address is holocausteducate.org. So if you have an acquaintance or a friend who couldn't participate in our session this afternoon, you can make sure to give them that website address. Again, is holocausteducate.org. Or if you want to go back and watch Marion again repeatedly, you can feel free to do that. So with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Marion, for some final thoughts.
Yeah, we're so grateful for this technology. Really, it's amazing. Without this technology, who knows whether we would have ever connected with this COVID in our midst. And talking about technology, please, please, please use this wonderful, wonderful technology, social media, for good only. Do not disparage others. Do not intimidate others. Do not embarrass your friends. Use it for good only. September 11th, 2001. None of us will ever be allowed to forget this date as long as we live. At that time, Nathaniel and I were in Florida visiting children and grandchildren and speaking in schools. And because all planes were grounded, we chose to drive home. And as we approached New York and crossed the Verrazano Bridge that I mentioned earlier, amidst the smoking ruins of the Twin Towers, we could see the Statue of Liberty, holding high the torch of freedom. It is that flame of freedom that the terrorists sought to destroy and could not, and never will, because we will take good care of our freedom. We will safeguard our freedom. We will not and must not take our freedom for granted. Let us all, each and every one of us, redouble our efforts to be kind and good and respectful towards one another. And with that, I wish each and every one of you, your children, your grandchildren, and all succeeding generations, a healthy, happy, productive future in a world of love and peace. And Mr. Bernstein, this was a wonderful way of commemorating Yom HaShoah, which we commemorate today in the Jewish calendar. So I personally and Nathaniel thank you again for making this possible, you and the Thaler Foundation. Thank you.
Well, Marion, we can't thank you enough for the time and energy that you've put into speaking with us over the last couple of days. We really appreciate it, and our best and our love to you and Nathaniel. Thanks very much.
Right. Thank you. And everyone, consider yourself hugged, and thank you so much for participating this afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.